terms of what is going on in this country, just even focusing the issue on what's going on here in the United States, I think many of us realize from any kind of a holistic, integrated perspective, anything that has to do with nonviolent political philosophy, that there's a question in the air as much having to do with who we are as in what do we need to do. Because everything we do is infused with our consciousness with which we do it. So I'd like to talk to you tonight about this moment. I want to talk to you about how I see it in terms of the larger arc of American history. And I want to talk to you about it from a nonviolent perspective, both why I think that's the only method of repair that has any chance of working, and also because I believe that that's in such alignment with the thinking of this moment. You know, the 20th century, every century is dominated by its own mindset. The 20th century was different than the 19th. The 20th century was dominated by Newtonian mindset, perspective, that the world was basically a big machine. And if you wanted to fix anything, you just tweaked the pieces of the machine. And that, of course, grew out of industrialization, the Industrial Revolution. You know, I'm going to tell you a little story. When I was in college, I don't know if this is true now, but for those of you who are old enough, when we were in college, we all had all these art posters on our door walls. That was what we did. And I had these pictures of huge angels. And they had been painted by a Scottish painter named Edward Burne-Jones. I didn't know who it was. I didn't know anything about the painter. I just knew that I loved these big paintings of angels. Several years later, at about the same time that I was in the middle of writing a book called Healing the Soul of America, I passed the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I was walking down the street, Fifth Avenue in New York City. And I'm sure you've seen, most of you, I'm sure if not all of you have been there, and you know they have these huge flags out in front of the building that point to whatever the exhibit is at the time. And I saw these huge angels. I thought, oh my God, those are the ones that I had when I was in college. And I was all excited. I went in, and the exhibit, they had that thing where, you know, there's a little box and you put in earphones and it's telling you about the author and the exhibit. Well, at that very time, I'd been reading about the American Transcendentalists. I was reading about their effect on Gandhi, the philosophy of nonviolence, Emerson, Walt Whitman, Thoreau, Louisa May Alcott, the Transcendentalists at that time, and how they were seeking to warn Western civilization that a terrible imbalance was going to occur if they allowed it to. That this whole machinery thing, this whole let's look outside ourselves all the time thing, was going to lead to a terrible imbalance in the consciousness of our civilization. And in fact, I learned that day that Edward Burne-Jones was one of the British artists who, because it was a phenomenon in both Britain and the United States, in response to the Industrial Revolution, and these were his words about those huge angels. Every time they build a machine, I will paint an angel. Well, those guys turned out to be right, of course, and the scientific revolution of the Western mind obviously has led to many good things, but we also know that it did leave a terrible imbalance. In the 21st century, there's a marvelous quote from a British physicist named James Jeans, and he said, it turns out the world is not one big machine. The world is one big thought. And as we enter the 21st century now, we're well into it now, the 21st century mindset, far more holistic, far more integrated, far more recognition that the internal dynamics of life and of people's lives within a civilization are every bit as important as the outer. And I think that that's one of the reasons, particularly, why we see the kind of change we see with Gen Z. Gen Z, they're not even 20th century people. Literally. They weren't even born there. If they were born there, they just were there for a few years as babies. And I totally, as many of them are well aware, I totally agree with them that they should not have to live their lives at the effect of bad economic ideas born out of 20th century thinking. So the problem with American society, actually, American society in many ways, as I see it, is not the problem. I've traveled enough throughout my career, and certainly within my political journeys as well, to have a very deep sense that the American people are not the problem. The American people, I'm not saying we're better than anyone else, clearly we're not, but I think we are as decent and as intelligent and if called to be as noble. Probably more distracted, but when we're called to be as noble as people anywhere. The problem is not that. You can see in every corner of our society that American consciousness is ready to move forward. You can see in any corner of our society, I'm sure anything that any of you do, that there is a more whole person, holistic, integrative aspect, and that anybody who is not recognizing that is kind of falling behind. But politics is stuck in a 20th century mindset. It's like something out of 1987, right? And there is a real, in every other aspect of American life, you want to move forward in order to succeed. But the people who run our political system don't want to move forward because they know they would be knocked off their perch. Right? To them, it's a kind of annihilation. And if you bring forward the kind of holistic, integrative thinking within the political domain, they'll call you fringe. They're fringe. They're the weirdos. Because they're talking about something that has so little application in terms of real efficacy or real compassion or care or focus or attention to not only our problems, but what is going to be necessary in order to endure them and in order to transform them. So I'd like to talk to you tonight about the political situation as I see it, in which psychological issues, historical issues, spiritual issues, emotional issues, and so forth are absolutely, in my estimation, essential. If we're going to have the deepest kind of understanding of what is happening, who we have to be in order to endure this, and also what it is that we have to do. I'd like to begin by going back to the beginning. You know, all that a group of people is a group of individuals, right? So the psychological dynamics, the life principles that prevail within the life of one individual actually do prevail within the life of the group. Okay? So what it takes to heal your life is what it's going to take to heal our life. And if there's something that's not cool for you to do as a person, it's also not cool for you to do as a country. Okay? All right, so let's go back to 1776, please. 1776, 56 very brave men. And I say that they were very brave because if the British had won the war, they would have all been executed. And they knew that when they signed that document. Right? 56 very brave men, therefore, signed a document that would change the world. And this document would change the world because it held 4 principles that were earth-shattering. They were very radical. They were radical then, and they're radical now. And they posited principles that completely repudiated centuries of social organization of countries and societies, okay? Number 1, that all men are created equal. I don't know about you, but I actually remember being, elementary school, junior high school, learning about the Sun King, the divine right of kings, that they actually thought God had given power to the king. God gave power to the king. King could share his power or her power, queen, with their rich friends, the aristocracy, their cronies, and everybody else. It was simply accepted that everybody else was basically to live in service to them. Okay? Here, all men are created equal. And then they said, if you're trans, if you're gay, if you're non-binary, it's still that same issue, right? Okay. Number 2, that all of us are created with inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So what would that be called today? Self-actualization. That you have is an inalienable right of your being alive, the right to do whatever you want to do. Be whatever you want to be, go wherever you want to go, fly as high as your own wings take you, and as long as you don't hurt anyone else, that's your inalienable right. Think about it. Number 3, governments are instituted to secure those rights, to protect those rights, not diminish those rights, not take away those rights, not undercut those rights, but to protect those rights. And number 4, most radical law, if you ask me, if government is not not doing its job. It's the right of the people to alter it or to abolish it. Yeah. That was an earth-shattering idea of enlightenment. Light means understanding, social enlightenment, possibly economic enlightenment, certainly political enlightenment. And the world would never be the same. It opened up a possibility through that ideal. It opened up a possibility through which millions and ultimately billions of people would walk and rush through. But it's also, now this is stupid, we know our history, it's also where things were very gnarly, because out of the 56 signers, 41 of them were slave owners. All right, so think about this, because that's America's story right there. It's our DNA. It's who we have always been. We are both and. We have always been both and. We have always been, and reiterating in every generation, which we'll talk about, both people who really get how important this is, whose hearts are this is big, and they have been willing to struggle for this, they have been willing to sacrifice for this, and many, many have been willing to die for this. But we have also been filled with forces of people who, for their own ideological and or financial purposes, had no intention whatsoever of seeing these principles actually made manifest, and who have proven throughout our history the links, sometimes atrocious, heinous, violence links, murderous links, to which they were willing to go to make sure that those principles would not be actualized. That struggle, that bipolarity is the American mind. And that struggle and that dichotomy has been lived out, reiterated in every generation. In some generations, more dramatically than in others. And in the cases of the most dramatic examples of forces backed by tremendous power, particularly financial and governmental power, who are perpetrating systems of complete injustice, completely contrary to our democratic ideals. Throughout our history, we have seen generations rise up and repudiate those systems of injustice. So yes, there was slavery in the United States. We also have ancestors who rose up with abolition and the Civil War and the passage of constitutional amendments to abolish slavery. Yes, we had institutionalized suppression of women in this country. And then our ancestors rose up. There was a women's suffragist movement and the passage of the 19th Amendment. We had the Gilded Age with its entrenched and inherent financial inequities. Generations rose up with the establishment of the labor movement, organized labor, and repudiated and rebuked those systems of injustice. And then we had institutionalized suppression of black people in the American South, foremost segregation, and we had generations with the civil rights movement rise up, rebuke, reject, with the civil rights movement, desegregated the American South, with the Civil Rights Act, with the Voting Rights Act. I ran for president this year because it's our turn now. This is you gotta really think this through, right? Because in other times there was a specific institutional reality. And so it was like an operable tumor. Slavery, get rid of it. Women can't vote, pass a constitutional amendment. This is more like a cancer that's metastasized. Because it's not one institutional reality, it is an economic paradigm. It's an idea. It's a very thought that has taken hold. It has hollowed out the moral core of this country. It has decimated our economy. It has decimated our democracy. It holds Washington hostage. It is the very thought that has now infused every corner of American society. You can't get rid of it. It's the very thought that somehow corporate profits, short-term corporate profit maximization for these huge corporate entities should take precedence over your safety, over your health, over your well-being, over your economic opportunity, and over your democracy itself. I think we should do what other generations have done in the most elegant, in the most sophisticated, and in the most nonviolent way. Say, hell no, no more of that. A matrix of corporate power, and it amounts to a system of corporate tyranny. And it is made up of huge corporate forces. It is insurance companies, which is why you don't have universal health care like they do in every other advanced democracy, and which a majority of Republicans as well as Democrats say they want. Not as big a majority, but a majority. It's why it's big pharmaceutical companies, which is why you have 1.3 million Americans rationing their insulin, which you don't have in any other advanced democracy because they have universal health care. It's big food companies, which is why you have carcinogens in your food that they don't have in other advanced democracies. I'm sure you probably saw that viral article that went out around about a bottle of ketchup in the United States versus a bottle of ketchup in Canada or the United States. It's big chemical companies, which is why there are chemicals and pesticides that harm a developing child's brain, and we know it. It's big agricultural companies and what it's done to farmers and to farming and to the land and to our relationship with food. It's big gun manufacturers, which is why guns flood our streets, even though both Republicans as well as Democrats, interestingly enough, including gun owners, want more universal common sense gun safety laws. It's big oil, which is why despite this canard about how much we're doing, this president's really good on that. It's like all he's doing to invest in green energy. Yeah, it's like a purse thief. Don't look over here, all this investment in green energy, and then you don't look at all this investment in dirty energy, when actually this president, I'm sorry to say, has given more oil drilling permits than even Donald Trump did. He's okayed the Willow Project, etc. Which means actually that when it comes to big oil and when it comes to defense, whether they're Democrats or Republicans in the modern era, those guys fall in line. So that's why we continue to ramp up rather than ramp down fossil fuel extraction, and of course it's why we've had so many military misadventures. Killing actually millions if you look at something like the Iraq War. Over 1 million people died over there. And of course thousands of our own soldiers died. And those 20 years in Afghanistan, and on and on and on. In military projects that we absolutely know had more to do, everything to do, in fact, with short-term profit maximization for the military-industrial complex as opposed to righteous foreign policy. I live in Washington, D.C. We all know this. The town is riddled with warmongers. It's called the Blob there. It's a forever war machine. Now, especially since Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision was passed in 14 years ago, ever since then, these corporate powers in the form of what's called dark money have been given unlimited permission to influence our legislators to the point where in policy after policy after policy, our legislators are doing more to serve those short-term profit maximization goals of their donors than to serve their own constituents. That's the new status quo in Washington. That's the status quo in Washington, and let me tell you something, that status quo will not disrupt itself. I have never been more sure of it. I've been in the belly of the beast. The only way that status quo is going to be disrupted is if we, the people, step in. To the Declaration of Independence. In the Jewish religion, it is said that every generation has to rediscover God for itself. And I think every generation of Americans has to rediscover those principles of the Declaration of Independence for ourselves. What do they mean to us in our time? If they're only inscribed on marble walls somewhere, if they're written on parchment underneath glass, but they're no longer inscribed in our hearts, they lose their moral force. They lose their life force. And when that happens, when we lose our emotional and psychological connection and immediate sense of radicalism around them, we become easy to play. And that's what's happened we've been played. We've been played so bad. And we've been played now for 50 years. Because for 50 years, there's been a $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. Now, for those of you who are young, I'm going to tell you something. And you might not even believe me, even though you actually, probably intellectually, are very aware of what I'm going to tell you. And the older people in the room are going to say, But just in case there's anybody so young and so far away from this long ago, far away land that you don't know, I want to tell you these facts, okay? It's about a long ago, far away land called the 1970s. The average American couple could afford a house. The average American couple could afford a car. The average American couple could afford a yearly vacation. The average American couple could afford for one parent to stay home with the kids if they wanted. One salary could support a family of 4, and they could send their kids to college. Thank you, I heard that. I knew I was saying. Not anymore. You know what you call that? You call it a thriving middle class. You call it a situation in which money was circulating, just like blood has to circulate in the body. Economic opportunity has to circulate in the society, or you don't have a thriving democracy. If you don't have a thriving middle class, you can't have a thriving democracy, because with money comes leverage. If everybody, we have 70% of Americans who say that they live with chronic economic anxiety. It's gotten to the point now, and this one, I'm going to say this 3 times, just in case the first time you hear it, it doesn't go deep in. I'm going to say it a second time, and then I'm going to say it a third time, just to make sure. You ready? 39% of Americans now report that they regularly skip meals in order to pay their rent. 39% of Americans now regularly skip meals in order to pay their rent. 39% of Americans now regularly skip meals in order to pay their rent. You know what I saw the other day? I thought this one was just, I couldn't believe it. I think it was CNBC, I'm not sure. It was one of those TV news programs. And it was the CEO of Kellogg Company. She probably saw it. And he said, and this was his line, I wonder what PR comms person came up with this. Well, you know, you gotta meet people where they are. And since so many Americans are now choosing to feed their families breakfast cereal for dinner, we just want you to know that Kellogg has a lot of good products. So I looked it up. He makes over $4 million a year. Since, gotta meet people where they are. So if they're hungry, Now, what could have happened, and what would have happened in a sane society? This is how sane, ethical capitalism would work. He would get up and say, and there would be a press conference. There would be 4 or 5 CEOs of the biggest food companies in America. They would say, given the crisis of hunger now occurring in this country, our companies are now committing that for the next year, there will be no blank shelf in any food bank in America.
Okay, man.
I went to the grocery store right in and buy every Kellogg product. They would end up making more money.
Yeah.
But at this point, we are so into this malevolence, and it is malevolent. People are dying because of it. A malevolent strain of unfettered, soulless capitalism that posits that the only responsibility of the corporation is its fiduciary responsibility to the stockholders. No other stakeholders matter. The workers don't matter. The community doesn't matter. Safety doesn't matter. The environment doesn't matter. And clearly, at a certain point, our lives don't matter. Now, what do you have when you have a marriage of corporate power and government? Somebody tell me the word. Fascism. But this is a soft fascism. Now now everybody's so upset about the actual, not soft fascists in our midst. But you know what? The only reason the big fascist was able to get so close to begin with is because there was too much soft fascism already happening. He should never have gotten this close. Everybody says to me, Marianne, how could you run? Don't you understand there's a fascist at the door? Oh, I'm running because there's a fascist at the door. Should never have gotten this close. And let's talk about how he got this close. Anytime you have large groups of desperate people, you should consider it a national security risk. And if you have even a basic understanding of world history, you know this. Large groups of desperate people form a petri dish out of which arises, inevitably, all manner of personal and societal dysfunction, including vulnerability to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. This is why the Marshall Plan after World War II, we had learned after World War I, Germany being so punished after World War I became easy prey for Hitler. That's why the Marshall Plan after World War II, we helped Germany rebuild. We helped Japan rebuild. We knew nothing could be more dangerous than if we didn't do that. So all of this despair has been festering. This has been going on for almost 50 years. There's such ubiquitous despair out there. All these people hanging out in the elite circles, whether Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Washington, what my career has given me. Not only my career before any political journeys, but also within it. What's going on in America? If you're in the top 20% of earners, life's good. I mean, the economy's good for the top 20%, and I celebrate that. We should all celebrate that. If we're in that 20%, be grateful for it. You can't have a thriving democracy when only 20% can have easy access to health care, when only 20% can have easy access. Even the health care issue. We have 79 to 90 million people who are underinsured or uninsured. So let's talk about that underinsured business. Yeah. There are millions of people. They're covered. They can go to the doctor. But their coverage, their insurance doesn't cover the test that the doctor wants them to have. The insurance doesn't cover the operation the doctor wants them to have. And the insurance for 18 million people doesn't cover the prescriptions that the doctors prescribe. I've heard doctors say to me, I don't even know why I bother to practice medicine anymore. I heard Dr. Victoria Dooley in Detroit. She said, if it were 20 years ago and I made a diagnosis of and prescription of a treatment, the most common question I would get is, what are the side effects? Today, she says, the most common question is, how much will it cost? No other advanced democracy is without universal health care. And our esteemed leadership will tell you that it's just so complicated here. I'm here to tell you it's not complicated, it's so corrupt. To you from the belly of the beast. So, what happens if you say, well, we got to change this, and I think I'll run for president because we got to change this. We got to have an economic bill of rights. That's the term that Franklin Roosevelt used. And this economic bill of rights, because we can't always be playing whack-a-mole, fixing it here, fixing it there. We need a comprehensive plan of economic reform. Comprehensive plan. We need universal health care, we need tuition-free college and textbook, like in every other advanced democracy. We should eradicate completely the college loan debt based on the Higher Education Act, which is possible, because they should never have existed to begin with. Going back, older people in the room, hello, we remember, until the 1970s, there was such a tuition-free college situation. I grew up in Texas. University of Texas had it, University of California had it, crown jewel of one. In fact, when Ronald Reagan became governor and said, let's get rid of this, that's when the Koch brothers looked at him and went, ooh, we like him, we can use him. Also, University of Florida had such a system. We also need subsidized child care. It's for millions of Americans. Child care is so prohibitive. We need child care, we need universal paid family leave, we need guaranteed sick pay. We need guaranteed living wage. We need a jobs guarantee. All of these things are considered moderate positions in every other advanced democracy. This is what I mean by we've been played. We've been trained to expect too little. The one party gives us crumbs. We won't take just crumbs. So we go to the other party and says, we'll give you cookies. You can't live on cookies either. Right? It's not enough. It's like we're Americans. We're supposed to put peace here. And when we talk about the money to pay for those things, I remind you, it's your money. It's your money. It's your taxes. And we need more than that, obviously. We need to make a just transition from a dirty economy to a clean economy, even if it means declaring a climate emergency. And we also not only need to shift from a dirty economy to a clean economy, we need to shift from a war economy to a peace economy. A Department of Peace. We need to proactively cultivate health, not just treat sickness, and we need to proactively cultivate peace, not just drop bombs or build more prisons if conflict or violence arises. Peace building is a real thing. There are 4 factors which statistically indicate when they are present, there will be a higher incidence of peace and a lower incidence of violence. That's true in a corner of a city, and you guys would know all about this. This is true in a corner of an American city. It would also be true in any other corner of the world. Those 4 factors are the following: greater economic opportunities for women, greater educational opportunities for children, a reduction of violence against women, and an amelioration of unnecessary human despair. That's where you prevent violence to begin with. But that goes back to the integrative, holistic politics I was talking about. All our system does is treat the symptoms because there's so much money to be made on treating the symptoms and not necessarily a lot of corporate profits to be made on actually preventing those symptoms. All it does is prevent, I don't know, the destruction of the earth and destruction of the species, right? So we need to have peace games just like we have war games. We need to have armies of peace builders, just like we have armies of military personnel. We need to be actually looking at the world and thinking 100 years down the road, a world without war in 100 years. That needs to be our goal. JFK said, if mankind doesn't get rid of war, war will get rid of mankind. And some people say, for me to say something like, we need to imagine a world without war 100 years from now and then reverse engineer from there. Some people would say that's very naive. I said what's naive is assuming there will still be a human race on this planet if we don't at least try. We also need a Department of Children and Youth because it's unbelievable the risk of America's children. If we want to have the America that we all love to think we're bequeathing to our children, let's say 20 years from now, we need to pay far more attention to children underneath the age of 10 today. There are millions of American children, and I assume some of them are here, who go to schools where they don't even have the resources with which to teach a child to read by the time they're 10 years old. If a child cannot learn to read by the time they're 10, their chances for high school graduation are drastically reduced. The chances of incarceration are drastically reduced. We need a massive transfer of resources to early childhood. We now know things about early childhood they didn't even know 15 years ago. And 90% of the brain is developed in the first 5 years. Right? So we need to give attention. We have children in this country who are traumatized by preschool. I have met principals at elementary schools in this country, elementary schools, who have told me they have students on suicide. There are regularly in public schools around this country, it's very common now, trauma rooms. That's why we're bleeding teachers. Teachers are like, this is not what I was educated to do. Not to mention the fact that they're not sure they can assume that they will be physically safe. Why, we should ask ourselves, should childhood so commonly be a trauma for the American child? By the way, we're the first generation of Americans, I have to say. so obsessively attentive to our own childhood traumas and so neglectful of the traumas of the children in our midst. Stress. I saw the study I saw actually was about Chicago public schools, where they talked about how many of the girls in Chicago public schools experience a level of post-traumatic stress that is as great as was the PTSD of returning veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq. But guess what? No. You say no, meaning horrible. Yeah, right. Well, guess what? Think about it this way too. For these girls and these boys as well, it's not post-traumatic stress. It's present traumatic stress.
Amen.
It is a trauma that is repeated every day as they walk to school.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you've been hearing about that on the campaign trail, have you? Of course you have. Because those kids aren't old enough to work, so they have no financial leverage. They aren't old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency. So it's just this collective neglect. It's a very tight conversation that the political establishment will even allow you to have. Now let's talk for a minute about what they do to someone who has the audacity to have it anyway. We've got a problem on our hands. And I don't want to make this personal about me because I'm a big girl and I have a life and I can handle it. But you should know. We have, yes, the Republican Party should be ashamed at all the voter suppression they exercise. But the Democratic Party should be ashamed at the candidate suppression that they exercise. Candidate suppression is a form of voter suppression. This is what it's come to. It's like the old Soviet Union. You get to vote, but we're going to make sure that your only choices are the people that we let in. Because their idea of a qualified candidate is someone, in their minds, qualified to perpetuate the system as it is. My idea of qualified is someone qualified to disrupt that system. Think that only someone really good at driving the car that drove us into this ditch should possibly be considered qualified to bring us out of this ditch. I don't think we need another political car mechanic. Washington has plenty of those. That's not the problem we have. The problem is we're on the wrong road. So I don't think we need another technocrat, this political class that feels it's so entitled, right, to make all these decisions, these experts, because after all, they've done such a bang-up job. We're 6 inches from the cliff. In terms of the state of our democracy, the state of our economy, the state of our environment, but they've really got this, right? So they think you have to be a technocrat. I don't think you have to be a technocrat. I think we desperately need a visionary. Now, I'm not saying that I am the greatest visionary in the United States, because I'm not, but I'm the only one running for the Democratic Party. Of money can get anywhere near the pinnacles of power. It's extraordinary how expensive it is getting all the ballots. The president, I remind you, has about $1 billion to play. That's the way the game is played. And if I think it's particularly incredible that we have what is the equivalent of state-controlled TV. How can you be an FEC registered, qualified, according to the founders, candidate for president of the United States, and CNN not even cover you? MSNBC not even cover you. And I remind you, when I ran last time, I was on CNN fairly regularly. I was on MSNBC regularly. But that time, they were satisfied to simply make fun of me and act like I'm an idiot and act like I'm foolish and a crystal lady and woo-woo and all that. They've always been big on calling me unserious because they know how serious I am. And the edict went out, obviously. Whatever you do, don't let that woman have a viral moment. It's really quite unbelievable. When I was at the same place in the polls as Nikki Haley, hers was called a surge, I was completely ignored. You probably read articles in supposedly reputable news outlets that the president had no opponent.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, complete invisibilization, complete erasure. I didn't get, Vivek Ramaswamy and Chris Christie, but they were so much lower in the polls than I got their CNN town halls. Once again, this is not about me, I'm a big girl, I'll be fine. But this is about how our democracy is working or not working right now, and that is why I want you to know. Now, we are where we are. The president has, I forgot to tell you one agenda item that I think is very important, and that I forgot to mention. So I want to go back, because it is of a whole. We, I believe, need to end America's war on drugs. Yeah. Right? Talk about that for a moment and go back to this issue of where we are. Richard Nixon initiated the war on drugs in 1971, and he said at the time that drugs were public enemy number one. Now, once again, I'm looking to see if anybody's old enough. Anybody old enough to remember Watergate? Okay. If you remember Watergate, you remember John Ehrlichman. John Ehrlichman was one of Nixon's aides who went to prison, actually, for his part in Watergate. And when he came out, he was so completely transformed. He had been the tightest of the tightest crew-cut Nixon kind of guys, and came out with almost like wearing beads, and it was fascinating transformation. And when he got out, he completely spilled the beans about everything. And the things he said about the inception of the war on drugs were particularly interesting. He said at the time, Nixon knew that it was not public enemy number one, and actually it was initiated in part as an attack on Black Americans. Mm-hmm. So I want you to remember, Black Americans use drugs at the same rate as white Americans. But you don't have policemen raiding white neighborhoods looking for drugs. Right? And on average, I'm sure you realize that if a Black person is convicted of a crime, they tend to get, on average, 20% longer. Now, hear me when I say this. When I was in college, there were 300,000 people imprisoned in the United States. Today, there are 2.3 million. And 46% of all federal prisoners are there for non-violent drug offenses. So the drug war completely feeds the prison industrial complex. It has done nothing to solve the problem. It has very much exacerbated the problem of drug use. Clearly what we're doing has nothing to do with actually helping people get sober. If I were president, I wouldn't want a drug czar, I want a sobriety czar. We should treat drug addiction in this country the same way a nation like Portugal does it. Where everybody's moving to Portugal, if you know. They treat drug addiction as a health issue, not as a criminal issue, and that is what we should be doing as well. We spend $1 trillion on the drug war. We spend $100 billion on it even now every year. And for a fraction of that money, we could be funding a world-class network of recovery options. Those options do exist in this country, but they are not universally available. Oregon tried the route of decriminalization. 3 years later, they're back to recriminalization because they didn't do it wisely. You can't just say, okay, drugs are decriminalized. You have to have the systems of harm reduction, etc. The last thing I want to say about that is that it would help us at the southern border. Because one of the main categories of reason why people are so desperate to immigrate to the United States from Latin American countries has to do with the violence that is perpetrated by the drug cartels. When we decriminalize, we're taking away their black market. We're not going to completely solve the problem that way, but it'll definitely put a dent in it. And also, it will give us bandwidth and resources with which to go after the drug that truly is a weapon to destroy us, and that is fentanyl. So I just wanted to mention that because, as I said before, the agenda that I propose of a fundamental social and economic U-turn is of one piece. Now, given many, many elements, much of which I've already mentioned about the erasure and invisibilization, if people don't even know you're there, and just how the system operates, dirtier than you can imagine, truly. Is corrupt and toxic, and politics of personal destruction and psyops and infiltration and all the stuff that you might think, multiply it at 100. Okay? Given that, be that as it may, I don't know about multiply by 100. As bad as you might think it is, I would say multiply by 10. But some of you probably already get there. All right. So the president has already gotten the number of delegates that he needs to be renominated. Therefore, I'm not asking you to vote for me on Tuesday so that I can win the nomination, because that's already locked up. But you know what's interesting about locked up? Slavery was locked up too, and a generation unlocked it. And the suppression of women was locked up too, and they unlocked it. And segregation was locked up too, and they unlocked it. So enough of the, oh, it's all locked up, there's nothing we can do. Yeah, there is, unlock it. But we unlock it in various ways. So I'm not saying, please vote for me on Tuesday so that I can be the Democratic nominee, because the president has already won the delegates. But I'm asking for your vote on Tuesday so that I can still make noise.
Make
So
that
that
noise.
I can
Make
still...
that noise.
I don't know how many of you in this room have donated to my campaign. But if you have, you bought those ballots, damn it! We had to go through a lot to get on those ballots. And I know this from experience now, and I think you know it too, being here tonight. There really is nothing like a presidential campaign as a platform for a field of conversation about what matters most in this country.
Yes.
There's something about it. And as long as I have access to this platform, there's the horse race, and then there's the human reality. You know, I suspended my campaign at one time, because after what happened in New Hampshire and South Carolina and Nevada, and particularly, I would say, I'm not gonna write a book actually about it, because I don't wanna have to revisit it. But
Wow.
it's something. So after that happened, after 3, I was like, okay, well, I'm getting out, because there's no path to getting the nomination. And then I realized after I'd done that, there's more going on here than just the horse race. And there are 2 realms. One is the realm of the American people. And you know, I have to tell you, I'm such a fan. You know, there's a beautiful listening in this room, for which I'm very grateful. I want you to know that this listening is everywhere in this country. The problem, as I said, is not the American people. The problem is a sclerotic business empire, which is the political media industrial complex. It is as much an industrial complex as is the food industrial complex, the agriculture industrial complex, the military industrial complex, or anything else. It is a corporatized business empire. It is not just something that chops wood and carries water for corporate interests. It is a corporate interest. And no differently than in any other area, it has no intention of allowing anyone in that's not one of them. Okay? And if we believe that that system is leading in the wrong direction, then we need to rise up as much as any other. Now, what are you supposed to do? It's not like that. I agree with when Gandhi said, they said, who is the leader of the Indian independence movement? He said, the small, still voice within. So we all have to rise up. Going back to what I was saying at the beginning, we all have to rise up. There has to be a new characterological aspect to what we think of as a well-lived, meaningful life. And remember, it can't just be, the traditional political candidate, particularly for president, says, I want to go to Washington and fight for you. But let me just say this. This is not my idea of a good time. I don't want to go to Washington and fight for you. What I would love the opportunity to do is to go to Washington and co-create with you. And the only safe repository for power in the United States is in the hands of the people. Not this political elite. Not this group. George Washington, in his farewell address, warned us about political parties. He said they could form factions of men more loyal to their party than to their country. Yes. And John Adams also said he saw it as a threat to our country. So I'm not saying get rid of the political parties, they are here, they have a function, but those major political parties deeply need to retrieve their souls.
Mm.
Deeply need to retrieve their souls. You should do what you should do. The calling of your soul will tell you what you should do. I am requesting, however, asking that you deeply consider voting for me. The more votes I get, the more eyebrows I can raise.
Mm. I like that.
Those in that establishment Democratic elite who refuse to take me seriously, I don't care if they take me seriously, but I would like them to take this point very, very seriously. And that is this. Franklin Roosevelt said that we would not have to worry about a fascist takeover in this country as long as democracy delivered on its promises. You're not going to win in 2024 by just warning people that he's a fascist. You're not going to win in 2024 by just telling people he's a threat to democracy. You have to actually be a pretty privileged person to think that's your top consideration. And to people who are hungry, their top consideration is whoever they think might help them feed their children.
Okay.
Now, I'm not saying there's any reason to believe that Donald Trump would do that. But number one, that's not how the mind operates. It wouldn't be operating thinking, would he do it or would he do it? The way the mind operates is, all I know is I'm not getting what I need right now. That's number one. And also, people who are in desperate situations throughout history, counterintuitively, have been even more attracted to the political strongman. We have a serious problem on our hands. Now, Abraham Lincoln said that the Declaration of Independence is an eternal rebuke to all systems of tyranny and oppression. And he also said, standing on the battlefield at Gettysburg, because you know Gettysburg, once the North won that battle, that was the decisive battle after which we could all say, yeah, the North is going to win this one. So he goes to the battlefield. And in speaking about the men who died there for the North, he said that they had given their last full measure of devotion. That a government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from the earth. It's perishing now.
Mm-hmm.
Today, Abraham Lincoln would be called a socialist. Of the people, by the people, for the people. Today, we're a government of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations. I already mentioned that Franklin Roosevelt said we wouldn't have to worry about a takeover, a fascist takeover in this country as long as democracy delivered on its blessings. We are going to beat Donald Trump in 2024 one way, by offering the American people material improvements to their lives in ways that are not being offered now. That is who is going to win. Someone who says, we're going to give you universal health care, we're going to give you Medicare for all, we're going to give you a way to work on only one job, we're going to give you subsidized child care. And when I say give, you're paying for it. This is not charity. And so the only way to override Trumpism, because it's really, you've got to think in much bigger terms than just defeating Trump. We've got to defeat Trumpism. Otherwise, just in every election, we're going to be they're popping up everywhere. That's not going to be, we have to defeat Trumpism. And Trumpism is a bit of an emotional and psychological darkness that could never have emerged except that we dimmed the light. Mm. And when you dim the capacity of people to thrive, you're dimming the light. Capacity of people to thrive economically, socially, and every other way is the point of American democracy. So being there for the people is the way that we're there for democracy. You can't talk about saving democracy if you're not willing to save hungry people, if you're not willing to save sick people, if you're not willing to save a sick earth. I've got to say this, and I've got to say this has been in my campaign. And that's why I stand for all the issues that you can see at Marianne2024.com. That is why I'm still talking. That is why I'm here tonight. I'm not kidding myself, and I'm sure you're not kidding yourself, that I'm going to win Illinois. But if I get, with every vote that I get, it's like with the uncommitted campaign, making a point But I would remind you also that if for anyone who's thinking about that, any vote on that line would be kicked out according to Illinois law, actually. Your state law, these states are different. Anything trying to do like that is not actually an uncommitted place. And I am a ceasefire candidate. And in this campaign, but the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, this will have to be a generational shift. And when I say generation, there's so many ways in which we have to get out of our silos. It's very, very important what your color is, what your sex is, your sexuality, your culture, your religion. There are times and places when all that does matter. But equally as important is that we're all Americans, and right now we also have to have an American conversation. An American conversation. And an entire generation, and enough is enough even on that generational thing. Not everything can be, who's a boomer, who's a millennial, who's a Gen Z, who's an X. We can't do that either for the American conversation. We are all the generation of adults, whether you're 18 or 80, and all of us must rise up as our ancestors rose up. Enough with people, no, it's so traumatizing. You think the people who walked across the bridge at Selma were not traumatized? It makes me so anxious. You think the girls, the women who marched for suffrage and who were thrown in prison for doing so, and for whom the conditions in the prison were so awful that they went on a hunger strike, to which the prison officials responded by sending men into the cells to force these metal contraptions on their necks in order to force feed them. Don't you think they were a little anxious, girls? We gotta toughen up, buttercups. We gotta be tough. We gotta be tough to take on what this generation needs to take on. And we really have to be tough. We need to have some tough skin. There are a lot of hours in the day. Sometimes you have to cry. Sometimes you have to go through the processing. You know, it's not like Abraham Lincoln wasn't a human being. Wasn't like, there's a famous story about Lincoln because his secretary kept very good notes. And there's a famous thing about Lincoln where, because when the Civil War started, they thought it was going to be 6 weeks. And it turned into the most horrifying 5-year war, 61 to 65, 4 years, 600,000 people died. I mean, 250,000 of our soldiers died in World War II. I mean, it was so devastating. And there's one story that's written in all of the biographies where his secretary would come in and tell him how many men had died in a particular battle. And Lincoln was known for taking his head in his hands and rocking back and forth. I cannot bear it. I cannot bear it. You think our ancestors had an easy time? No, they did not have an easy time. And this is not a moment when we can think only of our comfort. This is a moment for us to realize that, as Martin Luther King said, your life begins to end on the day you stop talking about things that matter. And I want to thank you for allowing me tonight to be here to talk with you about things that matter. And the next step is not further analysis. I didn't tell you anything tonight you don't already know. I might have said a statistic or two you hadn't heard, but I didn't tell you anything you don't already know. I read an article about myself years ago that I think applies to this phase of my career as well. I remember when I first read it, I kind of chuckled to myself because I thought, that's kind of true. It said Marianne Williamson isn't saying anything everybody else isn't saying. She just says it when the microphone is on. Further data collection, that's not the moment. No, it's the moment for courage. And I have a personal motto. Maybe it would be helpful to you, whether these are the words you would wish to use or not, but it really helps me. Pray in the morning and kick ass in the afternoon.